We're going to do a lesson today on multiplying and dividing positive and negative numbers. Multiplying and dividing are a little bit different than adding and subtracting, because when you deal with positive and negative numbers, when we added and subtracted, we kind of focused on positive numbers represented income and negative numbers represented debt. Multiplying and dividing really is a totally different way of approaching the problem. Remember, when we saw a dash out in front of a number like this, you know, we could say take away 6 or negative 6, but another way we could say this is the opposite of a 6. And you remember that the opposite of a 6 is a number that is 6 units the other direction from 0. So remember, on a number line, 6 is over here, but the opposite of 6 is the number on the opposite side of 0. So equidistant from 0. So if I have a 6 going in this direction, the opposite 6 means to go the other direction from 0, and that would locate you at negative 6. So the opposite 6 is actually going to be a negative 6. And when I read this, this actually stood for the opposite of a negative 5. So the opposite of negative 5, we said that was going to be a positive 5. So when we use this word opposite, it kind of implies basically just flip it. So if it's a positive, it flips to a negative. If it's negative, it flips back to a positive. So it's this flipping concept. A lot of times we'll think of like a light switch. You know, you kind of flip the switch. So when you do this multiplying and dividing, it's a good idea to think about flipping the switch. So when it comes to this problem right here, negative 3 times negative 5, what I like to do is just pull the dashes out and just look at this as 3 times 5. I know that 3 times 5 is 15. And basically what these are telling me to do is just flip the switch twice. So it flips to a negative, flips back to a positive. Therefore, that answer is going to be a positive 15. So notice I don't really have to do this all at once. I can do it in 2 separate pieces. I can put the numbers together and I can pull the negatives out. It's still all kind of there. When I pull them out, that basically just means to take the opposite of it. So the opposite and the opposite basically flips it back to a positive. So that makes it negative, and then it flips back to a positive. So what we pick up on is if there's 2 negatives in this problem, if there's an even number of negatives, what's going to happen is the result is going to be a positive number. So, even number of negatives, that result is going to represent a positive number. So, switch goes negative, flip back to a positive. So look at this next example. Notice how I have negative 2 times negative 3 times negative 6. Another way to look at it is pull out the negatives. There's 3 negatives, and just focus on 2 times 3 times 6. Well, I know 2 times 3 is 6, and 6 times 3 is, 2 times 3 is 6, and 6 times 6 is 36. And when you have these negatives there, just treat it like a little light switch. Negative flips to a positive, flips back to a negative. So it goes negative, positive, negative, just like a light switch. So notice that if there's 3 negatives, an odd number of negatives, it actually flips back to a negative. So if there's an odd number of negatives, the result is a negative number. So when I'm multiplying and dividing with negative numbers, all you really got to do is just count how many negatives are in the problem. The number of negatives is going to tell you whether it's positive or negative. So we kind of use this odd versus even. If there's an odd number of negatives in the problem, the result is going to be a negative number. If there's an even number of negatives in the problem, the result is going to be a positive number. So that we use this odd versus even a lot when we're working with positive and negative numbers in the terms of multiplying and dividing. So if I look at this problem here, what I should see is 5 times 1 times 2. 5 times 1 is 5, times 2 is 10. Then if I look through there, notice that there's only 1 negative. Since there's only 1 negative, that's just going to flip it to a negative. So it's going to make that a negative 10. Since there was an odd number of negatives, since there's only 1 negative, an odd number of negatives, that result will be a negative number. So looking at my next example, I have a negative 12 divided by negative 2. Again, just ignore the negativity. 12 divided by 2 would be 6. And how many negatives do we see in the problem? Well, there's 2 negatives in the problem. So that means it's going to flip back to a positive. If there's an even number of negatives, the result is a positive number. since there was two negatives, even number of negatives, that's going to make the answer flip back to a positive. So it goes negative, positive, so my result would end up just being a positive 6. So when I do 20 divided by negative 4, notice I can just go 20 divided by 4, which would be 5. But notice how there's only one negative. An odd number of negatives, that result will be a negative number. So since there's only one negative and odd number of negatives, that becomes then a negative 5. In case you don't, I throw a little asterisk out of here every once in a while. This usually means to kind of watch out. 5 divided by 0, this really has nothing to do with positive and negative numbers. We're actually having something really strange going on. We're dividing by 0. So some people say, well, 5 divided by 0 is 0. But remember, though, it has to check out. So remember, if I gave you 6 divided by 2 equals 3, that division problem has to check by going backwards and multiplying. Notice that 3 times 2 does give you 6. Since 3 times 2 gives you 6, it checks. So 6 divided by 2 is 3 because 3 times 2 is 6. So when I look at this problem here, 5 divided by 0 is equal to 0 because 0 times 0 is equal to 5. That should send up a flag. Does 0 times 0 equal 5? It doesn't. So that means my answer cannot be 0. So we will, 5 divided by 0, well, the answer must be 5 then, a lot of people think. If it's not 0, then it has to be 5. But let's look at it. 5 divided by 0 is 5. Well, is 5 times 0 5? 5 times 0 is 0. 0 does not equal 5, so it does not check out. So 5 times 0 does not equal 5. Therefore, that answer cannot be 5. So what is the answer? So if you look at this problem, what I'm trying to figure out is if you have 5 divided by 0, it's got to equal something. The question is, what can you multiply by 0 and get 5? So if we think this instead of a division problem, if we look back at it as a multiplication problem, 5 divided by 0 has to equal to whatever, but that whatever multiplied by 0 has to give you 5. And if you think about that, can you multiply 0 by a number and get 5? And what we discover is you really can't multiply a number by 0 and get 5. So that's what's going on here. So what this is telling me is 5 divided by 0 is not a workable problem. It's what we say is undefined. So I see this problem, 5 divided by 0 is going to be what we say undefined. That means it can't be worked out. So if you type that into a calculator, 5 divided by 0, the calculator is going to give you some type of division error. What that basically means is you cannot divide by 0. And if you have that answer basically means the answer is undefined. We can't actually assign a number to that division problem. So that's what we mean by undefined. No number can be identified as that solution. So it's just, we don't know what it is. It's undefined. So back to what we were trying to get into when we talk about multiplying, dividing, positive numbers. Remember, all you really got to do is you're multiplying and dividing, and then just pay attention to your signs. If there's an odd number of negatives, the answer is negative. But if there's an even number of negatives, that answer should be a positive value. So see if that helps out. Stay tuned.